I never imagined that living under the sea would feel like being trapped inside someone else's nightmare. The first time I saw it, through the thick glass of our underwater station, I froze, heart hammering, because the shadows didn't move like anything I'd ever known. There are 11 strange rules we have to follow, just to survive down here, and I remember the first time I broke one. It wasn't just dangerous, it felt like the ocean itself was watching me, waiting. Every glance outside could be fatal, yet curiosity clawed at me. Now each rule is a tightrope. I walk between sanity and terror, and I know that at any moment, I might cross the line that unleashes what's been lurking all along. Rule 1. Never stare too long at the shadows beyond the glass, no matter how curious you feel. I remember the first night I truly understood, never stare too long at the shadows beyond the glass, no matter how curious you feel. The station lights flickered, and the endless darkness outside seemed to breathe, pulsing in rhythm with my own heartbeat. My colleague Mara laughed nervously beside me, saying, "It's probably just the currents playing tricks on us," but her voice trembled, betraying her doubt. I wanted to believe her, but my eyes were drawn to a shifting figure that hovered just beyond the reinforced glass. Every second I looked, the outline became sharper, more defined, yet I couldn't tell if it was moving toward me or away, as if aware of my gaze. The next morning, I told myself it had been imagination, a trick of fatigue and pressure under the crushing weight of water above. Yet, throughout the day, every reflective surface, every monitor showing the outside, seemed to whisper the memory of what I had seen. Even the smallest shadow flicked across the glass sent shivers down my spine, and I caught myself glancing repeatedly, despite the fear gnawing at me. Mara tried to joke about seeing things, but I could see her hands shaking when she thought I wasn't watching. The station's hum, normally comforting, felt intrusive, reminding me that the shadows didn't sleep, and neither could I. By nightfall, I couldn't resist returning to the observation window. The first time I had broken the rule, it had been for only a few seconds, but now I was held by an almost magnetic pull. The darkness was no longer vague. It had shapes, intent. I whispered to myself, "It's nothing, just shadows," yet my voice sounded small, swallowed by the vast pressure outside. Mara stood behind me, placing a hand lightly on my shoulder. "Do you ever feel like they're looking back?" she asked quietly, eyes wide, refusing to meet mine. That simple acknowledgement of fear made the air denser, heavier, almost suffocating. Suddenly, a movement caught my peripheral vision, a flicker, a twist of darkness that wasn't following the current. I jerked my head toward it, but it vanished, leaving only an emptiness that felt far more threatening. My mind raced with possibilities, each more horrifying than the last, yet I couldn't look away again. The glass seemed to hum, vibrating slightly, as though resonating with something alive, just beyond reach. I realized that never stare too long at the shadows beyond the glass, no matter how curious you feel, wasn't just a guideline, it was survival. But knowing this didn't lessen the pull, and I found myself frozen, caught between terror and fascination, unwilling to break free. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time seemed irrelevant when your mind was stretched across an abyss. I imagined faces forming in the shadows, pale and featureless, yet unmistakably aware. I could hear Mara's breathing shallow behind me, feel the tremor in her hand as she gripped mine in silent warning. The more I resisted, the more my eyes were drawn outward, compelled to witness the impossible. Every fiber of my being screamed to turn away, yet my curiosity clawed, demanded understanding. The station's life support hummed with mechanical certainty, but outside uncertainty pulsed, alive, waiting for me to fail. I tried to recount every detail to anyone who would listen, yet words failed. I saw them move differently than water moves. I told Mara, who shook her head in disbelief, though her pallor betrayed her fear. "You're exhausted. You've been under this pressure too long," she said. But I wasn't tired. I was aware, painfully aware. Shadows shifted at angles that defied logic, and sometimes I swore I could see pairs of eyes blinking back at me, faintly luminous and unbearably cold. My hand pressed to the glass instinctively, heart pounding, knowing that proximity was meaningless. The rule existed because observation itself was dangerous, and yet the human mind tests every limit. As the days passed, I noticed subtle changes in myself. My dreams were haunted by underwater corridors and infinite dark shapes, echoing whispers just at the edge of comprehension. I became irritable, snapping at minor mistakes, afraid to be alone in the observation room. Mara started to leave her station light on when she slept, fearing that darkness outside might extend its reach into the interior. I told her it was paranoia, but secretly, I knew it wasn't. Every night, the urge returned to look, to see, to stare too long at what the human eye was never meant to measure. My reflection in the glass blurred with the shadows, merging, reminding me that Rule 1 wasn't merely caution, it was boundary. Then came the night I realized Rule 1 had a consequence far beyond imagination. I had stared just a fraction longer than I should have, and something inside the glass moved in a way that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a shadow in the currents, it mimicked me, exactly, every movement, every blink. My voice caught in my throat as I whispered Mara's name, and when she came running, the figure vanished, leaving nothing but the quiet hum of the station. Panic gripped me, realizing that Rule 1 wasn't just guidance. It was a tether preventing entities outside from reaching inside. That tether had weakened. From that night on, I obeyed never stare too long at the shadows beyond the glass. No matter how curious you feel, with a vigilance I hadn't known possible. I measured seconds, controlled glances, forced Mara to monitor my obsessions. The atmosphere in the station thickened. We slept less, ate less, always alert. Shadows no longer seemed passive. They waited, patient, sentient. The ocean beyond our walls had become a theater of subtle horrors, and any lapse, any overindulgence of curiosity, felt like an invitation. And yet, a part of me still wanted to see what lay beyond, even knowing that breaking Rule 1 again could cost more than my sanity. Rule 2. Never open any storage compartments, labeled with red markings, no matter how necessary it seems. I knew immediately that never open any storage compartments, labeled with red markings, no matter how necessary it seems, wasn't a rule to take lightly. The moment I saw the tiny crimson triangles on the metal doors in the corner of the station, a shiver ran down my spine. Mara nudged me, whispering, "We might need supplies from there. The others are running low." But I shook my head, heart hammering with a memory of shadows stretching just outside the glass. Even the faintest thought of opening one of those compartments made the station feel heavier, almost oppressive, as though the air itself resisted. The red markings weren't warnings. They were promises of consequences we weren't meant to test. Earlier that day, one of the newer crew members, Elliot, had fumbled with a crate near the red-marked compartment, joking about how rules were made to be broken. His laughter didn't reach my ears. It was swallowed by the uneasy quiet that had settled over the station. I felt my stomach twist as I watched him hesitate, fingers brushing the latch, but ultimately step back. The shadows beyond the glass seemed to pulse in response, subtle yet unmistakable. Even though the compartments were designed to be safe storage, the color alone sent waves of instinctive fear through anyone who understood the rules. It wasn't just superstition, it was survival. By nightfall, tension had coiled around every corridor like a living thing. The lights flickered intermittently, and the gentle hum of the station's systems felt like a warning drum. I caught Elliot glancing toward the red doors again, curiosity battling caution in his eyes, and I could hear him muttering under his breath, "What's so bad in there? It's just supplies." But I knew it wasn't just supplies. The moment a compartment with red markings is opened, the balance shifts. The shadows outside aren't just observers. They become participants, creeping closer, aware of our intrusion into forbidden spaces. Mara and I exchanged a tense look, silently agreeing to monitor him, knowing that one lapse could trigger consequences we weren't ready to face. The next hours blurred into a tense vigil. Elliot's fascination with the red compartments didn't wane, and I realized that mere observation wasn't enough. It was a test of self-control. The station felt alive in its response. Vibrations through the floor, subtle shifts in pressure, almost like the water itself was reminding us of Rule 2. Mara whispered, "He's going to open it," and I felt a cold certainty settle over me. My hands itched to stop him physically, but I hesitated, understanding that interfering directly could provoke the shadows further. There was a silent shared understanding among us. Some rules exist because the cost of breaking them is immediate, terrifying, and irreversible. Then it happened. Elliot's fingers brushed the latch, and I felt the temperature drop in the observation room. The shadows beyond the glass thickened, pooling unnaturally, as if aware that we were about to disrespect a boundary. I lunged forward instinctively, gripping his wrist, and his eyes widened in shock. "Stop! You don't understand," I gasped, voice strained with urgency. He pulled back slightly, confusion battling with fear, and the red compartment remained closed. But the tension lingered, heavy and suffocating. We both knew it was only a matter of seconds before our restraint would be tested again, and the consequences of failure would not be forgiving. For the rest of the night, every creak of the station, every flicker of light, felt like a prelude to disaster. The red compartments loomed in my peripheral vision, their warnings etched in bright, unyielding color, and the shadows seemed to mimic the shape of our fear. I kept my eyes on the glass, as Rule 1 had taught me, but Rule 2 now echoed inside my mind with equal urgency. We moved cautiously, whispering only when necessary, each step measured, aware that a single misjudgment could open doors we could never close. Even sleep offered no escape. The red markings haunted my dreams, each latch opening on its own, releasing horrors I could barely comprehend. By morning, Elliot had retreated to the safety of the main quarters, avoiding the red-marked compartments entirely, and I felt a temporary relief settle over me. Mara and I exchanged quiet words, acknowledging our narrow escape. "Some rules aren't just guidelines," she said, voice trembling. "They're walls keeping things in place we don't understand." I nodded, understanding the weight of Rule 2 in a way I couldn't explain. The ocean beyond our station was patient, indifferent, yet watchful, and any disregard for the rules seemed to ripple outward, changing everything just a little. Every red marking was a signal, a warning of what might come if curiosity overcame caution. As days passed, we learned to coexist with the red-marked compartments, using only unmarked storage for essential supplies, and leaving them untouched. The shadows outside seemed less active when the compartments remained closed, a subtle confirmation that Rule 2 was not arbitrary. Yet I could see the temptation in every new crew member's eyes, the irresistible pull of something forbidden. I realized then that Rule 2 was as much about controlling human nature as it was about survival, testing our ability to resist the very curiosity that defines us. Breaking it, even once, was an invitation to forces far beyond understanding. Late one night, I caught Elliot staring again at the red doors, his face pale in the dim light. I whispered, "Remember what happens if you touch it," and he nodded silently, swallowing hard. The station settled into an uneasy quiet, the shadows beyond the glass coiling like living smoke, patient and watchful. I understood then that Rule 2 wasn't just a rule, it was a barrier, a line between life and something much darker lurking just beyond our fragile station. One wrong move, one moment of reckless curiosity, and all of us would feel the consequences, irrevocably. And yet, despite my fear, a small part of me wanted to see what was inside. Rule 3. Never communicate with anyone outside the station using unsecured devices, no matter how desperate the message. The moment I fully grasped that never communicate with anyone outside the station using unsecured devices, no matter how desperate the message was more than a suggestion, a cold weight settled in my chest. The first time I tried to send a personal message to my family, through the emergency comms, I felt a strange interference crawl across the screens, warping the words into something unrecognizable. Mara noticed my hesitation and whispered, "It's not just the system, Usman, it's them. I froze, realizing that the shadows outside, the ones we feared for their silence, seemed to respond to attempts at connection, stretching their presence closer with every signal sent. Even casual communication now felt like a gamble, a test with consequences we could scarcely imagine. Hours passed as I wrestled with the compulsion to reach out, knowing that every unsecured message could serve as an invitation. I caught Elliot peering at the emergency comms again, curiosity flickering in his eyes despite my warnings. "What if someone needs to know we're alive?" he murmured, voice low but insistent, trying to rationalize the urge. I could feel the air thicken around us, oppressive and cold, as though the ocean itself was reminding me that Rule 3 existed for a reason far beyond common sense. The shadows outside shifted subtly, following each of our movements, and I understood that even a fleeting lapse could fracture the fragile barrier we had maintained since arrival. The pressure of isolation made the rule feel almost unbearable at times. Every day, I observed my own reflection in the glass and realized how thin the line was between sanity and panic. Messages that should have been simple became exercises in restraint, a test of endurance against my own desperate impulses. Mara, too, struggled silently, leaving only brief, coded signals for communication within the crew, carefully avoiding the unsecured channels that might reach outside. The station felt like a cage, and every glance at a device marked emergency use only reminded me that disobedience would ripple beyond our understanding, threatening to draw attention from the unseen entities that lurked just beyond the reinforced glass. Late that night, I found myself alone in the comms room, staring at a blinking console that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. The temptation was unbearable. I pressed my finger to the keypad, imagining sending a message that would reach home, that would reassure the people I loved, yet the shadows outside reacted instantly. I saw them gather in patterns that defied the currents, coalescing near the observation window as if aware of my intent. My breath caught, pulse racing, as I pulled my hand away just in time, whispering to myself, "Never communicate with anyone outside the station using unsecured devices, no matter how desperate the message." The recognition of danger was immediate, visceral, and terrifying. The next day, tension between the crew was palpable. Every movement toward a communication device was met with wary glances and whispered warnings. Elliot, still curious, tried to joke about sending a coded postcard, but Mara's glare silenced him immediately. I understood then that Rule 3 wasn't just a safety measure, it was a tether holding us together, binding us to caution and patience. Breaking it could open pathways we couldn't close, doors that led directly into the dark spaces outside, where the shadows waited with patience that spanned hours, days, even weeks. Our survival depended on strict adherence, and every whispered temptation had to be resisted, no matter how strong the human need to reach beyond. By the third night, the consequences of near breaches became terrifyingly clear. I caught flickers of movement in the water that weren't natural, forms that lingered closer to the station than usual, as though our thoughts and impulses were visible to the entities outside. The crew had begun taking shifts in the comms room, monitoring the devices with obsessive care, ensuring that no signal slipped through unsecured channels. Mara said quietly, "It's like they know what we think before we even act." I nodded, shivering at the realization that Rule 3 governed not just actions but even the silent impulses of the mind, teaching us that some boundaries are invisible but no less deadly. One particularly quiet stretch of the night tested me further. Alone, I stared at the blinking lights of an unsecured transmitter, imagining a single harmless signal, convinced that nothing would happen. The shadows outside responded almost immediately, forming shapes that seemed almost human, mimicking my hesitation, mirroring the internal struggle I felt. My pulse quickened, and I whispered urgently to myself, "Stay calm, never communicate with anyone outside the station using unsecured devices, no matter how desperate the message." The reminder burned like fire through my veins, anchoring me to caution as the darkness pressed closer, the threat of unseen eyes reminding me that even a single lapse could have catastrophic consequences. By dawn, the lesson of Rule 3 had been burned into my consciousness with the force of water under pressure. We moved carefully, spoke minimally near any device capable of transmitting outside, and learned to rely on silent signals and observation rather than risky communication. The ocean beyond our station was no longer just a backdrop, it was an active presence, aware of our every temptation and thought. The shadows outside weren't merely passive observers, they were sentient, patient, waiting for the moment when curiosity or desperation would betray us. And even as I walked the corridors with measured steps, I knew that Rule 3 would continue to test our restraint, patience, and resolve in ways that no one could fully anticipate. Rule 4. Never touch any unknown objects that drift into the station, no matter how harmless they appear. The first time I realized that never touch any unknown objects that drift into the station, no matter how harmless they appear, was more than a guideline. I froze as a small pale shape floated against the outer glass. Mara stood beside me, breath shallow, her hand hovering over the observation panel. "It looks like debris, maybe from the last supply drop," she whispered. But instinctively, I knew the rule existed because appearances were deceptive here. The shadows outside seemed to pulse closer as the object lingered, responding to our attention. Even the faintest curiosity about picking it up felt like a challenge issued directly to something unseen, something waiting for a misstep. Earlier, Elliot had almost reached for a floating container, thinking it was a sample from the previous dive, and I had grabbed his wrist just in time. "Don't you remember the rule?" I hissed, voice tight, as the water outside seemed to darken in response to our movements. The station's hum became oppressive, vibrating against my chest, reinforcing the danger. Mara and I exchanged a glance that carried more weight than any words could. This wasn't just about objects, it was about preserving the fragile balance between the interior of the station and the unknown pressures lurking beyond. Every drift, every anomaly was a potential threat, and the shadows outside mirrored that awareness in their slow, deliberate movements. By nightfall, the floating debris had multiplied, shapes I couldn't identify drifting slowly past the observation windows. The station's alarms remained silent, yet the tension in the air was palpable, as if the very walls anticipated a breach. Elliot's curiosity gnawed at him, and I saw him glance repeatedly at one of the pale objects. "It's just a container, right?" he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. But his voice trembled. Mara's eyes widened, and she muttered, "You can't touch it, not even a glance should lead to handling." I realized then that Rule 4 existed, because the ocean beyond wasn't just dark, it was intelligent in a way that responded to intent, curiosity, and foolish bravery. Hours later, I caught myself staring too long at a particular object, trying to discern its shape through the distorted glass. My pulse accelerated as the shadows outside rippled unnaturally, stretching toward it, as though aware that I was assessing a potential breach. The temptation to reach out was overwhelming, yet instinct screamed at me to resist. I whispered under my breath, "Never touch any unknown objects that drift into the station, no matter how harmless they appear," trying to anchor myself in the rule's protective authority. The air inside seemed heavier with every second, and I realized that observing was almost as dangerous as touching. Every decision, every fraction of hesitation, carried weight beyond my understanding. The next day, the station's crew organized a strict observation schedule, noting every object that drifted close and cataloging its movements without physical contact. Elliot looked frustrated, his curiosity barely contained, while Mara and I maintained constant vigilance. The shadows outside seemed to respond to our compliance, remaining just beyond reach, patient and silent. The object from last night had moved away with the current, leaving a void that felt almost alive. I shivered at the realization that Rule 4 wasn't just about objects, it was about respecting forces beyond comprehension, boundaries we weren't meant to challenge. Later, a new object appeared, larger and oddly reflective, its surface catching the dim station lights in a way that made it look almost alive. I felt the magnetic pull of curiosity, an urge to reach out and touch it despite everything I had learned. Mara whispered sharply, "Don't even think about it," and I forced my hands to my sides, grounding myself in the rule. The shadows outside gathered closer, almost merging into the darkened water, their presence suffocating. Every drift, every anomaly, became a test of self-control and understanding, a constant reminder that the ocean's depths were alive in ways we could not fathom. As night deepened, Elliot's frustration got the better of him. He stepped toward a drifting object, fingers trembling, and I grabbed his arm again, heart pounding. "Do you want to see what happens if we break Rule 4? I whispered, voice tight. His eyes went wide, and for a moment, I thought he might comply, but the shadows outside shifted subtly, almost like a warning, freezing us both in place. It was a reminder that even a momentary lapse could ripple outward, altering everything we had carefully maintained. The tension was tangible, thick enough to taste, as the station seemed to pulse in rhythm with the outside currents. By the early hours, we realized the objects weren't random. Each carried a presence, subtle but undeniable, responding to our attention and intentions. Mara and I double-checked every protocol, knowing that a single mistake could have irreversible consequences. Elliot, pale and shaken, finally understood that the rule existed not out of paranoia, but necessity. The shadows outside had shifted back slightly, patient but watchful, proving that Rule 4 was a shield as much as a boundary. And yet, despite our vigilance, a small part of me couldn't shake the feeling that one object would eventually reach inside, testing us in ways we weren't prepared to endure. Rule 5. Never leave the observation deck alone after dark, no matter how confident you feel. I quickly learned that never leave the observation deck alone after dark, no matter how confident you feel, was more than a precaution. It was survival. That night, the shadows outside seemed to thicken, as if the absence of a second observer amplified their awareness. I could feel the cold pulse of water against the station walls, pressing inward, almost sentient, responding to even the smallest movement. Mara had insisted on accompanying me, but Elliot, restless and reckless, tried to sneak past us toward the deck, muttering, "It's just routine checks." I caught him in the dim light, gripping his shoulder, heart hammering, knowing the rule existed for a reason we had yet to fully understand. As we moved along the narrow corridor, the hum of the station's life support seemed to fade, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible vibration through the metal floors. I kept glancing at the observation windows, where shadows swirled unnaturally, growing thicker in corners I hadn't noticed before. Mara whispered, "It feels different tonight," her voice tight, eyes wide. I nodded, sensing that the rule was not merely about physical safety. It was a tether, anchoring us against the unknown. Being alone meant exposure, and exposure invited the shadows closer, teasing boundaries we weren't equipped to test. Hours passed in tense silence, as we scanned the exterior, noting unusual currents and subtle forms in the water. Elliot tried again, suggesting he could handle the rounds by himself, but I shook my head, every instinct screaming no. "You don't understand," I said firmly. "Even being alone changes everything." Mara reached for my arm, squeezing lightly, reinforcing the truth we both knew. The shadows outside weren't idle observers. They were aware, responsive, patient hunters, waiting for a solitary lapse, and the thought of being isolated while they watched sent shivers down my spine. At one point, a strange ripple in the water caught my eye, a movement that defied the flow of currents. My breath hitched, and I instinctively reached for Mara's hand, gripping it tightly. The shadows outside seemed to respond immediately, coalescing near the edge of the observation window. Elliot had hesitated at the corridor entrance, staring at the darkened waters, and I realized the rule wasn't only about being physically alone. It was about the vulnerability of focus, the heightened risk of misjudging intent when one's attention is unshared. Each second alone could invite forces we were powerless to control. Later, we huddled near the center console, scanning the monitors that projected the exterior currents. The darkness beyond the glass seemed alive, curling around objects, drifting shapes and shadows with intent. Elliot tried to joke about the rule being overblown, but his voice trembled, betraying him. I could see him glance repeatedly toward the deck, temptation written across his features, and I understood that Rule 5 existed because isolation magnified danger. Even brief lapses of attention or confidence could be enough to invite the unforeseen, and the shadows outside thrived on such moments. By midnight, the station felt smaller, corridors longer, and every glance at the observation windows carried weight. I realized that the rule was as much about mental vigilance as physical presence. Mara and I rotated our watches carefully, never leaving the other alone, aware that the slightest misstep could bring consequences we were ill-prepared for. The shadows responded subtly to our adherence, lingering at the periphery, but not closing in, as if acknowledging that we respected their boundaries. Yet even compliance didn't remove the tension. The awareness of what might happen if the rule was broken was constant, gnawing at our nerves. Suddenly, a shape moved rapidly across the outer glass, distinct from the currents, angular, deliberate. My stomach dropped, and I grabbed Mara's shoulder to steady myself. "We can't leave the deck alone," I whispered, voice tight with urgency. "Not tonight, not ever." She nodded, gripping my hand as the shadows twisted and coalesced, responding to our attention and presence. The knowledge that being alone, even for a moment, was a vulnerability struck deeper than fear itself. Rule 5 was not a guideline, it was a lifeline, a measure of protection against an intelligence we could barely comprehend. By dawn, the crew had reinforced the rule with strict rotations and double checks. No one would be alone on the observation deck, ever. Even Elliot had learned, though grudgingly, that confidence and recklessness were dangerous, especially in the presence of shadows that waited, patient, responsive, and aware. The station hummed with the quiet rhythm of safety measures, but the awareness of Rule 5 lingered like a shadow itself, unseen but impossible to ignore. And yet, in the back of my mind, a whisper of curiosity remained, hinting at the untested limits of the darkness outside, and I knew that Rule 5 would always demand vigilance. Rule 6: never attempt to repair any exterior damage without a partner, no matter how minor it seems. I had quickly learned that never attempt to repair any exterior damage without a partner, no matter how minor it seems, was a rule that could not be bent, even for something as small as a cracked panel or a loose hatch. That afternoon, a subtle fracture had appeared on the outer glass near the observation deck, barely noticeable but enough to make the station shudder when currents shifted. Mary and I exchanged tense glances, understanding immediately that even a single person working alone outside could provoke consequences far beyond mechanical failure. The shadows lurking beyond the glass seemed to thicken, almost as if they were aware of the pressure building inside the station. My hands shook despite gloves, heart hammering at the thought of violating Rule 6, even momentarily. Earlier, Elliot had tried to volunteer for a minor repair, joking about his experience with undersea equipment, but Mary and I stopped him immediately. "It's too risky," I said, voice low but firm, aware that any deviation could draw the shadow's attention. Even the faintest sound of movement outside seemed amplified, as though the ocean itself was listening. I could feel the weight of Rule 6 pressing against every instinct I had to act independently. The glass reflected our anxious expressions back at us, reminding me that even preparation could not substitute for the strict adherence the rule demanded. Every second alone outside could invite something we were not prepared to confront. By evening, the tension in the station escalated. We prepared the repair equipment with meticulous care, checking each tether, oxygen line, and harness, knowing that one mistake could be fatal. The shadows outside swirled closer to the observation window, responding to our movements with an almost sentient patience. Mara whispered, "If we slip, even a tiny crack could become catastrophic," and I nodded, understanding that Rule 6 wasn't just about cooperation. It was a safeguard against forces beyond comprehension. Being alone outside was a vulnerability the ocean, and whatever lurked in it would exploit immediately. As night fell, Elliot peeked nervously at the fracture again, muttering under his breath, "It doesn't look that bad. Maybe one person could handle it." My stomach twisted as I grabbed his arm, shaking my head. "No, you don't understand. Rule 6 exists for a reason," I hissed, voice taut with urgency. The shadows outside thickened, pooling near the deck, a subtle but undeniable warning. Even the faintest attempt to ignore the rule seemed to ripple through the water, carrying intent we were powerless to conceal. I felt my pulse race, knowing that the consequences of breaking Rule 6 were immediate and terrifying, not something we could predict or control. We waited until both of us were secured with tethers and lines before approaching the damage. The moment we worked together, the station seemed to stabilize, the oppressive weight of the shadows retreating slightly, acknowledging compliance. I realized then that Rule 6 wasn't merely about mechanical safety. It was about vigilance, cooperation, and respecting the unseen intelligence outside. Any solo action, no matter how confident, risked exposure to the entities that waited, patient and aware beyond the reinforced glass. Every repair became a delicate dance, each movement measured, each glance calculated, knowing that the ocean itself observed with intent. Hours into the repair, the shadows outside began to shift unnaturally, forming patterns that mirrored our movements almost exactly. I felt a creeping fear, realizing that even following the rule did not guarantee safety. It only minimized risk. Mara's hand tightened on mine as we worked, a silent reminder that presence mattered more than tools or expertise. Elliot watched from the observation window, pale and silent, understanding at last that Rule 6 demanded not just compliance, but total respect for forces we could barely comprehend. The fracture was fixed, but the memory of the shadow's response lingered, a reminder that every decision carried weight far beyond our perception. By dawn, the repair was complete, and the station hummed steadily, the air feeling marginally lighter. Yet I couldn't shake the lingering awareness of the shadow's patience, waiting for the next lapse, the next solo action that might provoke them. Rule 6 had proven itself again. Safety was not a matter of skill alone, but of adherence, cooperation, and recognition of forces beyond human understanding. Even small fractures in the station's exterior carried enormous risks, amplified by our isolation in the depths and the silent intelligence watching from outside. Every lesson was etched into our minds, a constant reminder that compliance was survival, and survival required respect for the unseen. Rule 7. Never open the station's emergency airlocks without verifying both interior and exterior conditions, no matter how urgent it feels. I had learned quickly that never open the station's emergency airlocks without verifying both interior and exterior conditions, no matter how urgent it feels, was not a suggestion but a lifeline. That evening, a sudden fluctuation in the water pressure triggered the emergency airlock alarms, and my stomach tightened with instinctive dread. Mary and I rushed to the control panel, hearts hammering, knowing that a single misstep could flood the station, or worse. Elliot hovered nearby, muttering about rushing in to fix it quickly, but I shook my head, aware that the shadows outside reacted instantly to the slightest disruption, their presence coiling closer with each impulsive movement. Earlier in the week, a minor alarm had caused Elliot to panic, nearly reaching for the airlock without verification, and I had grabbed his wrist just in time. The tension in the corridors had been palpable, the station's hum suddenly oppressive, as if the metal itself was aware of our near mistake. Mara whispered urgently, "Even a small error here could bring the ocean inside," and I nodded grimly, understanding that Rule 7 existed because the airlocks were more than mechanical doors. They were thresholds, barriers keeping the immense patient pressure of the deep and the shadows beyond at bay. Compliance required focus, discipline, and a deep respect for the forces outside. By nightfall, the alarms had triggered several false positives, each one a test of patience and adherence. I could feel the shadows outside shift in response, as if they were gauging our reactions, noting when frustration or impatience threatened our judgment. Elliot tried again, suggesting we could bypass the checks for speed, but Mara's glare silenced him immediately. "No shortcuts," she hissed. "Rule 7 exists because even minor mistakes are amplified down here." I felt the truth of her words pulse through me, a visceral reminder that our survival depended not just on caution, but on precise adherence to the rules designed to keep the ocean, and whatever lurked within it, at a respectful distance. Hours passed as we carefully monitored both interior sensors and external conditions, verifying water pressure, current fluctuations, and the stability of nearby hull panels. Each moment alone at the control panel made my pulse quicken, the shadows beyond the glass stretching and twisting with uncanny patience. Mara's hand rested on the edge of the console, steadying me silently, reminding me that no one should face the threshold alone. Even the faintest lapse in verification could provoke consequences we weren't equipped to manage, and the rules were our only protection against the invisible intelligence that observed our every move. The tension escalated when a sudden movement in the water caught my eye, a dark, angular shape drifting near the exterior of the airlock. I froze, heart hammering, realizing how fragile our safety truly was. Elliot leaned toward me again, whispering, "Maybe it's just debris," but his voice faltered, betraying his own doubt. Mary and I exchanged a silent agreement, eyes locked as we methodically confirmed all readings before even thinking of opening the airlock. The shadows outside reacted almost immediately, gathering closer, a silent warning of the danger inherent in impatience. Rule 7 had proven itself again. Vigilance and verification were the difference between life and disaster. By midnight, the fluctuations had stabilized, and the emergency systems had been reset without incident. The station hummed steadily, the oppressive weight of outside observation lifting slightly as our compliance held firm. Yet I couldn't shake the lingering awareness of the shadow's patience, waiting for the moment when human error might slip through. Rule 7 wasn't simply about procedure. It was a test of restraint, awareness, and respect for forces beyond comprehension. Even routine emergencies carried the potential for catastrophe if the rule was ignored, and I knew the lesson would remain etched into my mind every time the airlock alarms sounded. As dawn approached, I reflected on the subtle, constant tension Rule 7 imposed. It wasn't only the airlocks that mattered, it was the awareness they demanded, the need to remain calm and methodical, even when instinct screamed to rush. Mary and I had survived another night intact, but the shadows outside remained, patient and observant, reminding us that one lapse could unravel everything. The rule was clear: verification first, action second, no matter the urgency. And I understood, more than ever, that the station's safety relied not on courage or confidence, but on unwavering adherence to Rule 7. Rule 8. Never attempt to retrieve anything that falls outside the station, no matter how valuable it seems. That evening, I was reminded with cold clarity that never attempt to retrieve anything that falls outside the station, no matter how valuable it seems, was a rule designed to protect our lives more than our belongings. A small piece of equipment had slipped from the observation deck, spiraling into the blackness beyond the reinforced glass. I felt my stomach twist as I instinctively reached toward it, heart hammering, but Mara's firm grip on my arm stopped me. "Do you want to test what Rule 8 really means?" she asked quietly, eyes wide with a mix of fear and urgency. The shadows outside seemed to pulse, curling around the lost object, responding to our longing and hesitation. Earlier, Elliot had jokingly suggested we could just get it back, convinced it was a simple matter of maneuvering the tether, but I shook my head sharply, knowing better. The station seemed to vibrate subtly under the pressure of the deep water, almost as if the ocean itself was aware of our impulses. Mara whispered, "Anything that leaves the station might not just be lost. Sometimes, it chooses to take you with it." I swallowed hard, realizing that Rule 8 wasn't about mere loss. It was a warning that curiosity and attachment could be exploited by forces we couldn't see or understand. The very thought of crossing that boundary made the hairs on my arms rise. Hours passed with the object drifting slowly away, carried by unpredictable currents, and I could feel an almost magnetic pull to reach out. My pulse raced as I imagined recovering it, convinced I could do it safely, but instinct screamed otherwise. Mara's steady presence reminded me that our lives were more important than material possessions, and that Rule 8 was a lifeline, anchoring us against temptation. The shadows outside seemed to linger near the glass, aware of our desire, almost playful in the way they mirrored our tension. Every glance at the drifting equipment reminded me of how fragile our security truly was. By nightfall, the darkness outside felt oppressive, the shadows thickening around the lost object, shapes coiling with an almost deliberate awareness. Elliot peered through the observation window, voice tight as he whispered, "Maybe we could," and then he trailed off, realizing the folly of his thought. I placed a hand firmly on his shoulder, grounding him in the lesson that Rule 8 demanded patience and restraint. Even the tiniest breach of caution could provoke consequences, and the station's hum seemed to remind us that safety relied on strict adherence, not bravado or risk-taking. The shadows outside responded immediately to any hint of temptation, growing darker, more purposeful. Late into the night, I sat near the observation deck, watching the object drift further away. Mara stayed close, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder, a reminder that no one should face these choices alone. The shadows outside moved with eerie coordination, almost as if aware that we were resisting the urge to intervene. Rule 8 wasn't just a precaution, it was a measure of survival, teaching us that desire could be manipulated, curiosity punished, and patience rewarded. Every second we resisted, the station felt safer, though the awareness of what could happen if we failed remained ever present, a silent weight pressing against our nerves. By the next morning, the object had disappeared into the depths, carried far beyond our reach. I felt a strange relief, tempered by an even stronger respect for the rule. Elliot's face was pale, his expression marked with a reluctant understanding of the boundaries we had to respect. Mara and I exchanged a glance, acknowledging silently that Rule 8 had tested not just restraint, but our ability to survive the temptations that the ocean and its shadows set before us. The lesson was clear: anything lost outside was never worth the risk, and the deep sea would not hesitate to exploit human weakness. Even hours later, I could feel the lingering presence of the shadows, coiling near the station, as if confirming that our obedience had been noted. The rules weren't arbitrary, they were protections against forces that were patient, sentient, and utterly indifferent to our desires. Rule 8 had reinforced the lesson that attachment, even to the smallest piece of equipment, could compromise everything. And though I understood it intellectually, a part of me still quivered at the thought of what might have happened if I had ignored it, the open abyss outside waiting silently for any lapse in judgment. Rule 9. Never turn off the interior lights during observation hours. No matter how comforting darkness seems, I had learned quickly that never turn off the interior lights during observation hours. No matter how comforting darkness seems was more than a comfort rule, it was a matter of survival. That evening, fatigue gnawed at me, and I longed for the soft darkness that often made the station feel less oppressive. But the moment I reached for the light switch, Mara's hand clamped down over mine. "Do you want to invite them in?" she asked quietly, eyes wide with urgency. The shadows outside the reinforced glass seemed to react instantly, gathering in corners, stretching toward the dim glow, as if darkness itself was an open invitation. I froze, understanding that Rule 9 existed, because the deep had eyes everywhere. Earlier in the day, Elliot had muttered about turning off the lights to get some relief from the harsh fluorescence, joking that the shadows won't care about a little darkness. I had grabbed his arm, shaking my head, my pulse hammering as the shadows seemed to thicken, lingering where the light dimmed. Mara whispered, "It's not just light. They watch when we weaken our vigilance." I understood then that Rule 9 was about presence as much as illumination. Our visibility acted as a tether, a boundary against the lurking patient forces beyond the glass. The slightest lapse could invite attention, and the ocean, dark and immense, seemed to pulse in response. Hours passed, and exhaustion made the temptation almost unbearable. I imagined curling up in a corner, letting the lights fade, thinking the shadows would respect our isolation. Mara stayed near, watching intently, occasionally adjusting the brightness, ensuring that no corner of the station slipped into darkness. Elliot, pale and wide-eyed, kept glancing at the switch, murmuring under his breath, "Just a minute," but the warning in Mara's gaze silenced him instantly. The shadows outside reacted subtly, shifting like living smoke, and I understood that Rule 9 wasn't arbitrary. It was a tether keeping the unseen intelligence at bay, demanding constant vigilance. Late into the night, a strange reflection on the glass caught my eye, a pattern that wasn't caused by the interior lights. My pulse quickened as I realized the shadows outside seemed to respond to every flicker of dimness. Even the smallest adjustment of brightness drew subtle movements, a reminder that compliance with Rule 9 wasn't optional. Mara's hand gripped mine briefly, a grounding reminder that we weren't meant to face the darkness alone, and that every second of light mattered. Elliot shivered nearby, silent now, realizing that the shadows outside had the patience of centuries and only required one lapse to seize an opportunity. By early morning, we had rotated shifts to ensure constant monitoring of the lights, with Mara double-checking circuits and observing every reflection in the glass. The shadows had settled slightly, retreating to the edges, patient but ever watchful. I could feel the tension lingering, the unspoken threat of what might happen if a single corner of the station went dark. Rule 9 had reinforced the lesson that vigilance was not passive. It required active maintenance, presence and awareness, with consequences that could ripple through the station instantly. Darkness was seductive, but obedience was survival. Even as dawn approached, I noticed subtle movements in the water beyond the glass, shapes curling and stretching in response to our illumination. The station's lights, bright and unwavering, formed a fragile boundary that separated us from what lay beyond. Elliot, quiet and pale, finally understood the lesson of Rule 9. The comfort of darkness was never worth the attention it invited. Mara and I exchanged a silent nod, acknowledging that compliance with the rule wasn't merely about procedure, but about survival, vigilance, and respect for forces we could barely comprehend. And still the shadows lingered, patient, waiting for any lapse in our awareness. Rule 10. Never enter the maintenance tunnels alone, no matter how urgent a task seems. I had learned with stark clarity that never enter the maintenance tunnels alone, no matter how urgent a task seems, was a rule carved from experience and terror. That night, a subtle alarm indicated a minor pressure drop in one of the lower corridors, and my instincts screamed to investigate immediately. Mara's hand stopped me as I reached for the access panel. "If you go alone, you won't come back the same," she said, voice taut with warning. The shadows outside the reinforced glass seemed to ripple in response, coiling along the walls and corners, aware of the tension, as if waiting to see whether we would respect the rule. Earlier that evening, Elliot had argued that he could handle a simple inspection by himself, insisting, "It's just a routine check. Nothing could happen." I shook my head sharply, feeling the station vibrate subtly, as if echoing my warning. Mara added quietly, "The tunnels are not just metal and cables, they're traps for the careless." I realized then that Rule 10 wasn't about convenience or habit. It was about protecting us from unseen presences that thrived in isolation. Every shadow and whisper in the tunnels magnified when someone was alone, transforming ordinary maintenance into a gamble with survival. Hours passed as we approached the tunnel entrance together, both tethered to safety lines and each other. The dim lighting inside cast long, strange shadows across the walls, making it impossible to ignore the intelligence lurking within. Even with two of us present, I felt the weight of Rule 10 pressing against my chest, every instinct screaming that we were intruding into territory the ocean had claimed. Elliot watched from the observation window, pale and silent, the gravity of the rule finally settling into his mind. The tunnels were alive in a way that required respect, attention, and unwavering adherence, and Rule 10 was the boundary that ensured we didn't provoke what waited inside. As we navigated the winding corridors, the shadows outside the station's glass seemed to follow our progress, curling and stretching like smoke in water. Mara whispered, "Even a single misstep could trigger a collapse," and I nodded, heart racing. The tunnels amplified every sound, the creak of metal, the hum of ventilation, the subtle vibration of water against the hull, and made our presence known to forces unseen. Rule 10 demanded more than caution. It demanded cooperation, patience, and absolute adherence to procedure. Even minor urgency could become fatal when isolation invited attention. Late into the night, we reached the compromised section of the tunnel, repairing the minor leak with meticulous care. The shadows outside shifted subtly in recognition of our teamwork, coiling but not closing in. I realized then that Rule 10 was not merely about the tunnels themselves, but about presence, vigilance, and shared responsibility. Each corridor, each corner, held unseen threats that only adherence and cooperation could mitigate. Even as the repair concluded and we retreated, I felt the lingering weight of what could have happened had I ignored the rule and entered alone. The shadows were patient, but they remembered. By morning the station had returned to its uneasy calm, but the lesson of Rule 10 lingered like a whisper in my mind. The tunnels were conduits, not just of air and systems, but of observation, manipulation, and danger. Elliot, still pale and shaken, finally understood that urgency was never a reason to break the rules, and Mara and I shared a silent nod, acknowledging our narrow survival once more. The shadows outside remained, patient, observing, their presence a constant reminder that isolation could be exploited in ways we could barely comprehend. Rule 10 had held us safe, but only just. Rule 11. Never look directly into the water at night without a protective barrier. No matter how calm it appears, I had learned painfully that never look directly into the water at night without a protective barrier. No matter how calm it appears was not a guideline, but a lifeline etched into survival itself. That evening, fatigue gnawed at me, and the still black surface beyond the observation window tempted me to stare, to search for shapes in the depths. Mara grabbed my shoulder just as I leaned closer, whispering, "It's not just darkness, it's them." The shadows outside reacted instantly, gathering near the glass with an intensity that made the station feel fragile, like a thin shell keeping forces beyond comprehension at bay. My pulse surged, and I realized that breaking Rule 11 could summon consequences faster than any physical breach. Earlier that week, Elliot had nearly violated the rule, claiming he wanted to see the currents at night. I had shaken my head sharply, guiding his gaze elsewhere while the shadows responded, almost sentient, as if aware of his curiosity. Mara whispered urgently, "Even a glance is enough to invite them," and I understood the terrifying truth. Rule 11 existed because intent alone could draw attention. The water was not passive, it was alive with awareness, a darkness that responded to focus, to eyes daring to penetrate its depths without protection. Every moment spent resisting the temptation felt like holding a thin thread against a storm. Hours passed as we monitored the exterior from behind, reinforced panels, the calm surface reflecting nothing but shadows, yet concealing shapes that twisted and shimmered just beyond perception. Elliot, pale and silent, finally comprehended the danger, following Mara's lead without argument. The shadows seemed to test us, stretching along the glass, as though aware of every glance and hesitation. Rule 11 demanded vigilance, patience, and absolute restraint. Even the faintest lapse could invite entities that were patient, intelligent, and utterly indifferent to human fear. Each second of compliance felt like a battle against instinct, curiosity, and the invisible forces pressing in from the depths. Late into the night, I caught movement below the station, shapes shifting in ways that defied natural currents. My fingers tightened on the protective barrier, heart hammering, as I whispered to myself, "Never look directly into the water at night without a protective barrier." No matter how calm it appears, Mara's hand rested on my arm, a grounding reminder that we were never to face this alone. The shadows outside the glass coalesced subtly, acknowledging our adherence, but hinting that patience had limits. The ocean, vast and unfathomable, waited silently for any lapse in vigilance, its depths concealing intelligence we were powerless to comprehend. By dawn, The water had returned to a deceptive calm, yet the memory of the night lingered like a cold pulse. We knew now that the shadows weren't just lurking. They were sentient, patient, and aware of every human error or temptation. Rule 11 had held us safe, yet the threat remained, eternal and unyielding. Elliot, Mara, and I moved through the station with an unspoken understanding. The rules weren't arbitrary. They were shields against forces that existed beyond comprehension, requiring constant vigilance, respect, and unity. And as I glanced once more at the blackened water outside, I knew that compliance alone had kept us alive, but survival was fragile, and the ocean never forgot. The station hummed softly, life support steady, yet I could feel the shadows lingering near the glass, patient and watchful, reminders that the deep had a memory, a will, and a vigilance far beyond ours. The rules had saved us, one by one, each teaching restraint, respect, and the necessity of obedience in the face of incomprehensible danger. And though we had survived another night, I knew the lessons were eternal, etched into the very walls of the station and our minds. The water waited, calm yet alive, and I understood that any lapse, even a fleeting glance, could summon consequences we could never undo. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.